I'm Jessie Munton. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy. Welcome to my exp. Epistemology has tended to focus on the belief states that we do form. It's well placed to ask questions like, is that belief state justified? Is it the output of a reliable process? Is it a portion to the evidence? Does it constitute knowledge, for instance? I'm really interested, in addition to that, in all the things that our mind is not doing. So I'm interested in the beliefs that we're not forming, the evidence that we're not attending to or using, the belief states that perhaps we form, maybe they're well grounded, they're well justified, but then we neglect them, we don't use them in reasoning. There are certain inferences, for instance, that we don't form. And epistemology to date is much less well able to evaluate that kind of negative state. What I think of as negative epistemology is the project of coming up with resources that let us say a bit more about that. Because that negative space is not monochromatic, it's textured. There are different ways of not forming a belief or not knowing something, and they can have different epistemic statuses. Of course, you're not going to know everything. It's inevitable that any human is ignorant of uncountably many things. Most of the things that a person could know, you're never going to know in the course of a lifetime. We have to accept that. It can't be a problem that people don't know all of these things that they could never know. On the other hand, sometimes it does seem epistemically problematic that you don't form certain beliefs. If you're in certain situations, it might be very puzzling that somebody you're with has failed to form certain beliefs. So we need resources that can kind of pull those two apart, and that can allow us to describe in a more fine-grained way that negative space and the variations that occur within it. I like to use this word permissibility because we are engaged in a project of trying to forge new epistemic resources. I like the term permissibility because it's quite loose. It allows for lots of different ways in which something might be impermissible. The permissibility problem is the problem of teasing apart when it is epistemically permissible not to know something, in the sense that we would not criticise an agent for not knowing it, perhaps. Or maybe criticism isn't the thing that all epistemologists are most concerned with, but when we might say it doesn't impugn somebody's epistemic standing that they failed to come to know something. Impermissible ignorance is cases where we feel like it is to somebody's discredit as an epistemic agent that they have not come to know something. And so the permissibility problem is the problem of distinguishing these two from one another, of explaining why we say that some cases are permissible and why some cases are impermissible. So sometimes I also use the term legitimate ignorance or illegitimate ignorance. Partly these terms are loose to allow people to have the space then to think about what does it mean for it to be illegitimate, what kinds of more precise forms of evaluation do we want to make here. Is the individual always blameworthy or criticisable even if their ignorance is illegitimate? Perhaps not. We maybe want to separate out off the question of when do we blame an individual and when is their ignorance illegitimate. Trying to answer the question of when is ignorance legitimate, when is it illegitimate, I think often intuitively that tracks the extent to which you have been exposed to a particular body of evidence. So if you have had easy opportunity to learn something and you haven't done so, that can seem illegitimate, but it isn't always illegitimate. I mean, there's just so much you could be learning. If you are at a university, you have libraries absolutely crammed full of books. But there's a bunch of them you're never going to read while you're there, inevitably. And so I think there's something else in play which can make ignorance illegitimate. It's not just the ease with which evidence is available to you, it's also the intuitive importance or relevance of that information to you. So I think that these judgments are very complicated. Sometimes we are saying, well, look, given that you have this question, should you have attended to this evidence and that would have led you to know something? Maybe you didn't do that, that's why it's illegitimate. But other times, I think the thing we're really concerned to critique is, why wasn't this a question for you? So it's not just about evaluating the strategy that you adopted once you had a question, but also trying to begin to criticise our practices of asking certain questions and not others, because that's absolutely crucial. It might be that you are doing an absolutely tip-top job of answering one small subset of questions, but you are illegitimately ignorant because you are neglecting another set of questions. We need to strike a balance between trying to find answers to certain questions and also on asking the right questions. That's absolutely crucial. And when we switch our focus to thinking about what we should attend to, it gives us more resources to say, we don't just want to answer questions, we also want to ask the right questions. So I think questions are really fundamental to shaping our mental lives. And we want to make sure that we are positioned to ask a broad range of questions. So when you think about some of the ways in which, as a society, we've perhaps devalued certain groups, often that's happening because we're not asking a certain set of questions about them or about their experiences. We're just focusing on asking a set of questions which the status quo gives rise to. We aren't stopping and asking background questions about why do we have this particular status quo in the first place. I think you also see this in play in journalism. So any time that a newspaper is making a decision about what stories to put on the front page and what stories to put further back, they are making a decision about what information to prioritise and what information to deprioritise. But more important than that, anytime they take up a particular angle on a story, they are making a set of decisions about which questions, even about that particular story, are most important. So which questions will the reader want to be resolved most efficiently and effectively? And so it's really crucial that we think critically about which questions we should be asking in any given context, as well as what makes a good answer to a question. Forgetting is absolutely fascinating because the more I have looked into it, the harder it becomes to give a unified account of all of the ways in which we use this term forgetting and the kinds of things that we use it to describe. And so one challenge for me as a philosopher is to try and figure out if there is something that draws that all together, that lets us give a unified account of the sorts of things we describe as forgetting. Often it's natural to think of forgetting as a kind of negative state in two ways. It can seem like a negative state because it's primarily privative, that forgetting is something, it's a failure. It's when your mind hasn't performed in the way that you want it to. And that in turn can mean that it's a negative state in a second way, which is it's kind of normatively negative, that it's a bad thing to forget. I think both of those are wrong, and I think in saying that I'm very much in line with work that's being done in neuroscience that investigates the ways in which forgetting is absolutely essential to the good functioning of the mind. There's also really interesting work in philosophy on the ways in which it can be ethically appropriate and good to forget, that you don't want to be trapped in a state of always remembering certain things. Forgetting is also not a negative state in the sense it's something that the mind is doing actively. It's not just a passive failure to hang on to information. Forgetting is effectively deprioritising information. So if you never forgot anything, you couldn't really learn new things, but you also couldn't attend to the things which are most relevant at a given moment. I think of forgetting primarily as rooted in access. So I think when you forget something is when you cannot access it. But often, in fact, most of the time, that is a transitory state. So when you're put in a different context, you might be able to remember it, or given a bit of time, something might come back to you. And so what we're trying to do when we give an account of forgetting is describe these kinds of access failures in some sense, if it's right even to call them failures, and what kinds of inability to access information count as forgetting and when they count as something else. For me, forgetting is then an attentional phenomenon. So if you think of attention as this kind of prioritization of information, forgetting is the flip side of that. It's just that deprioritization of information. It's that inability in the moment, or maybe not even inability, but just the fact that you do not access certain information at a given time. The mind is very surprising to me in two ways that seem incompatible with each other. One is it can do so much stuff. it's kind of amazing. And it can do all these things without me even noticing that it's doing them. I can solve problems sometimes even when I'm sleeping or when I'm attending to something else. But I also find it humbling and kind of reassuring in a way, curiously, to think about the limitations of our minds. We're such little creatures cognitively, struggling to integrate all of this information. Sometimes I look at other animals like dogs and you kind of think, I wonder what they can really understand of the nature of reality. What's their understanding of time, for instance, and how that operates? And then I think that there must be possible creatures who would be so much more cognitively sophisticated than us that they would look at us and they would laugh and say, look at these funny little creatures with their limited understanding of 4 dimensions, and they're struggling to understand how all the other dimensions are wrapped up like a carpet. Or they would look at our attempts to solve certain problems, and for them their understanding of the nature of reality would be so much deeper than ours. I think that's kind of a sort of wonderfully reassuring thought in some sense, that ultimately our appreciation of reality just reflects this very peculiar sort of human brain that we have. And there were all these mysteries of the universe that, I don't know, maybe we'll never really be able to understand.